Welcome to Relax at Night, where stories meet soft moonlight. Tonight, we bring you a story of quiet harbors and second chances, of love rediscovered when the heart least expects it. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the waves carry you to the coast of Maine. Marianne's car wound along the narrow road that hugged the Maine coastline, her headlights brushing against the whispering pines and glimpses of dark water beyond. It had been 17 years since she had last taken this drive, back when her hair still caught the light with gold, and her hands had not yet learned the habit of loneliness. Now the same road felt older like her, but no less familiar. The town of Greyhaven Harbor waited ahead, small and quiet, wrapped in salt air and the sigh of tides. She told herself this was just a visit, just a place to breathe for a while after. The divorce papers were signed, but beneath that something deeper pulled her here, a memory, a voice, or maybe a promise she had once made to herself long ago. The first thing she noticed when she reached town was the way the harbor lights trembled on the water, like the world was trying to remember how to glow again. She parked outside her aunt's old cottage, the one that had sat empty since last winter, and for a long while she did not move. The night was still, except for the soft moan of the sea and the cry of a gull drifting somewhere out in the dark. She thought of Daniel, her ex-husband, and the quiet, aching years that had led them here. Two people who had built a life that eventually stopped feeling alive. There was no anger anymore, only the silence that follows. A long storm inside the cottage smelled faintly of cedar and sea salt. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. She lit a few candles, made tea from a box that must have been years old, and sank into the old armchair by the window. The harbor glimmered through the glass, the same view she had loved as a girl. She could almost hear the laughter of her younger self, barefoot and sunburned, chasing waves with her childhood friend Jack Hollis. She had not thought of him in years, though. Once at 17, she had thought she might marry him, but he had stayed when she left, and that was how life divided them quietly, without goodbyes. When sleep came, it was light and uneven. Dreams slipped in like tides, fragments of faces, echoes of old summers, the touch of a hand she could not quite remember. Morning arrived, gray and soft, the air heavy with mist. Marianne stepped outside with her coffee and felt the town wake slowly. Around her, fishing boats pushing off from the dock gulls, wheeling low, the faint hum of conversation from the cafe near the wharf. It was all as it had been except her. The bell above the cafe door jingled soft and familiar as Marianne stepped inside. The place smelled of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked muffins, the kind of scent that wrapped around a person and reminded them that life, even after heartbreak, could still feel warm. The cafe had not changed much since she was a girl, the same wooden counter polished by decades of elbows, the same row of framed black and white photos showing fishermen with their catch, the same creak of the floorboards that seemed to sigh under the weight of years. A woman behind the counter looked up, her hair streaked silver, her smile wide. Marianne Harper. Well, I'll be damned, you're back. Marianne blinked, then laughed softly. Elsie, you're still running this place 30 years and counting, Elsie said proudly. Though now my knees do most of the complaining. Sit down, honey. Let me get you a coffee. I heard you'd moved away, married that architect fellow. I did, Marianne said, easing onto a stool by the window, and now I've unmoved, I suppose. Elsie poured the coffee and gave her a look, kind, knowing the sort that didn't need words. Small towns had a way of remembering people even when they tried to forget themselves. Well, it's good to see you back, she said. Greyhaven always keeps a light on for its own outside. The harbor shimmered in a weak morning sun, the mist slowly lifting to reveal fishing boats bobbing in their berths as Marianne watched a tall figure stepped off one of the boats, carrying a crate of nets. He moved with a kind of easy steadiness, the rhythm of someone who had long made peace with the sea for a moment. She didn't recognize him until he turned toward the dockside and lifted his cap to wipe his brow. Jack Hollis' time had changed him, but not so much that she couldn't see the boy beneath the man, his hair darker, touched with gray, his shoulders Broader, his movements slower, but more certain. He had been a dreamer once always. Talking about leaving town, building boats in some distant harbor, maybe even traveling the world, yet here he was still in Greyhaven, anchored like the old boats. Themselves, Marianne felt something stir in her chest, not the rush of youth, but a quieter warmth like the tide rolling in after years of calm. Jack still runs the Hollis boats. Elsie said, following her gaze, never did leave you know, took over after his father passed, spends most mornings out at the point or in the shed by the docks fixing engines for half the town. He's steady, one of the good ones. Marianne smiled, faintly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. He always was. The door opened again, the bell chimed in cold sea. Air rushed and Marianne didn't need to turn around. She somehow already knew it was him. His voice, low and familiar, reached her first morning. Elsie got any of those blueberry scones left, only if you share with old friends. Elsie teased when Marianne looked up. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Neither spoke. The years between them folded quietly, 17 summers, 17 winters, and in that small sunlit cafe time seemed to hold its breath. Jack's expression shifted from surprise to something softer, gentler. Marianne Harper, he said at last, his voice carrying disbelief and memory. Well, I'll be damned. I seem to be hearing that a lot this morning, she said, smiling high. Jack, he laughed, that same warm, rough laugh that had once made her heart trip. Hi yourself, you back visiting, or for a while, she said simply. Maybe longer. I'm staying at my aunt's old place. Jack nodded as if that answer carried 100 unspoken things. He didn't need to ask. Cottage still standing barely, she said, laughing softly, but it's home for now. He sat down beside her for a few minutes. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the fishing season, how the tourists had come and gone, yet beneath every word ran an undercurrent. Neither of them acknowledged the awareness of shared history, of something that had once begun but never quite finished. When he stood to leave, he hesitated, then said, you should stop by the dock sometime. I'm usually there, could use a hand untangling the old nets. Marianne tilted her head, smiling. You still terrible at knots? Worse than ever. Their laughter lingered in the air long after he was gone. Outside, the sea glittered brighter than before, and Marianne realized she was smiling without meaning to. It wasn't the same giddy feeling she had once known it was. Quieter, gentler, but somehow deeper. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She was simply here, and that she thought might be the beginning of everything. The next morning, the harbor woke beneath a pale sun, the fog thinning, curling away from the water in slow ribbons. Marianne stood by the cottage window, cradling her coffee, watching as single gull trace circles above the pier. Sleep had come easily the night before, the kind of deep, salt-scented rest she hadn't known in years. Maybe it was the sea air, or maybe it was the quiet certainty that Greyhaven still had space for her. The world here didn't ask anything of her. It simply let her be. After breakfast, she found herself walking toward the docks, though she pretended she didn't know why. The wooden planks creaked beneath her boots. The air tasted faintly of fish and brine, the sound of gulls sharper, now cutting through the hush of the morning. Farther down, she saw Jack crouched beside one of the boats, his sleeves rolled up, his hands working through a mess of tangled, nutting thought. I might find you here, she called out. He looked up, squinting against the sun, and smiled. Or maybe you just knew I can't handle a knot to save my life, Marianne laughed, walking closer. Some things never change, some things do, he said quietly. And for a moment, their eyes met, not the way old friends look, but the way people look when they are wondering what might have been. She knelt beside him, picking up part of the net. You still start your mornings with this every day since I can remember. Keeps me out of trouble. They worked side by side in silence for a while, the rhythm of their hands sinking without thought. The sea lapped gently at the pilings. Somewhere behind them, a bell chimed from the church tower, marking the hour. It felt like the world was a no rush, like even time itself slowed down here. Jack glanced over at her. So the city didn't stick. Marianne shook her head. For a while it did. I thought I had what I wanted, a husband, a career, a nice apartment, but somewhere along the way I started missing the sound of the sea more than the sound of my own life, he nodded. Slowly threading a line through the net, I get that I once thought I'd leave this town too. Then my dad got sick after he passed. I stayed to keep the boats running. Guess one day turned into a decade. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. He looked out over the water, his jaw tightening for just a moment before he said, sometimes, but regrets don't row boats. I just keep moving. Marianne studied him in profile. The lines around his eyes, the sunburned skin, the quiet strength in his shoulders. Life had weathered him, but in a beautiful way. She had spent so many years surrounded by people chasing more and more money, more recognition, more of everything. And here was Jack, content with less, but somehow more alive than anyone she had known a breeze. Picked up lifting strands of her hair across her face, Jack reached out without thinking, gently tucking one behind her ear. His fingers lingered for the briefest moment, warm and careful, before he pulled away. Sorry, he murmured, old habit, Marianne. Smiled faintly, no need to apologize for a heartbeat silence held between them, full, unhurried, and strangely intimate. Then a fisherman shouted from down the pier, and the moment passed like a tide receding quietly back to sea by the time they finished. Mending the net, the sun had climbed high, and the harbor was alive with movement boats. Coming in children running along the shore, laughter drifting through the air. Jack stood brushing his hands on his jeans. You've still got the touch, didn't it? Think you'd remember how turns out some things come back to you, she said, smiling. He hesitated, then added, there's a little fair up by the lighthouse. Tomorrow night, bonfire music, the usual Greyhaven chaos. You should come, be good to see you. There I might, Marianne said lightly, though the warmth in her chest told her she already knew she would. As she walked back toward the cottage, she found herself humming a tune she didn't recognize, but that felt familiar anyway. The tide lapped gently at the shore, whispering in its steady rhythm, and for the first time in years, Marianne realized that her heart wasn't heavy anymore. It was just quiet waiting that night as she stood on the porch, watching the moon rise over the water. She thought of Jack, the way he still smelled faintly of salt and cedar, the way his laughter filled the air like sunlight through fog she had come back to. Greyhaven looking for rest, but now she wondered if she had stumbled upon something rare or not. Just peace, possibility. The following evening arrived, wrapped in the scent of salt and bonfire. Smoke drifting over the hill where the old lighthouse stood. The town had gathered there just as it did. Every summer lanterns swinging from wooden posts, music spilling from a small band near the dunes. Laughter carried on the wind. Marianne could see it all from the cottage porch, the glow of the fire, flickering against the darkening sky, the faint hum of life and warmth calling her toward it. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled to herself and began the walk along the shore. The sand was cool beneath her feet, the tide crowing close, then slipping away again as if teasing her steps. The lighthouse beam cut through the dusk, sweeping in wide, slow arcs across the harbor. The closer she came, the more she could hear the murmur of familiar voices, the clinking of glass, the soft rhythm of a fiddle playing some old coastal tune she remembered from her childhood. For a heartbeat, she was 17 again. The world still open, the night still endless, and Jack, Hollis still the boy who had known every thought she never said aloud when she reached the circle of firelight. Jack was there, standing with a few of the fishermen, his shirt sleeves rolled, his face touched with amber glow. He turned just as she stepped closer, his eyes catching hers, and for that single moment, it felt as though everything else went quiet. The music, the laughter, even the sea, it all faded until there was just them and the firelight between. Them you came, he said, his voice low but warm. I did, she replied, pretending to sound casual, but her smile betrayed her, maybe. I wanted to see if Greyhaven still dances on summer nights, always has, he said, and held out a hand. She hesitated only long, enough to take a breath, then let him lead her toward the open space near the fire. Someone had started a slow tune, gentle and winding like a wave, rolling to shore they began to move together, not gracefully, not perfectly, but naturally, her hand in his palm steady against her back, the music wound around them, carrying with it the scent of pine smoke and salt, and the murmur of waves below the cliff. Their laughter came, easy like it had all those years ago, each step soft and careful, like rediscovering a language they both still somehow knew. Jack looked down at her, his eyes warm. You still remember how to follow? I remember how to trust, she said quietly, and he smiled, that same unguarded smile she had forgotten. She missed the song. Faded into another livelier one, but they stayed where they were, swaying gently, long after the tune had changed the crowd around them, blurred into a haze of motion and light. Marianne felt the air shift cooler, now the wind brushing through her hair. She could feel the rhythm of his heart beneath her fingertips, steady, sure, familiar. When she finally stepped back, the night seemed softer, as if the world itself had exhaled. Come on, he said, nodding toward the path leading down to the water. You should see the view from the rocks before the fog rolls in. She followed him through the winding trail, the sound of music growing faint behind them. The moon had risen high, silvering the sea below, and the lighthouse beam turned slow and steady across the waves. When they reached the rocks, they stood side by side in silence, watching the reflection of light stretch and shiver across the water. I used to come here after long days, he said. Sometimes I'd think about leaving, starting over somewhere new, but then I'd see this and remember why I stayed. Marianne glanced at him, the glow of the lighthouse brushing across his face. It's beautiful, she said. It's home, he replied simply, and the words settled deep within her. For long, while they said nothing, just listened to the sea breathing against the stones, the wind tangling through their hair, the quiet between them, comfortable and full. When she finally looked at him again, his gaze met hers and held steady. In that moment, she realized the years had changed them, both carved them into new shapes, but the core of what had once been between them was still there, patient, enduring, waiting like the tide for the right moon to return. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the fair behind them, but it felt far away, unreal compared to the pulse of this quiet place. Jack stepped a little closer, his voice barely above the whisper of waves. Maybe you were meant to come back, Marianne. Maybe we both were, maybe, she said. And when their hands brushed, it felt less like a beginning and more like something finally coming home. The morning after the fair, the air felt different, the sky heavy with clouds that moved low over the water, the kind that promised rain. Marianne sat by the window of the cottage, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, the soft hum of the kettle now silent. She could still feel the echo of last night, the warmth of Jack's hand, the rhythm of the dance, the sound of his voice against the wind. Everything about it lingered like the scent of the sea. In her hair, she had thought she had forgotten how to feel something that simple, that real, and yet it had returned without warning, quiet and steady, like the tide itself. Outside, the first drops began to fall, tapping against the glass. She watched them slide down in thin silver lines. She remembered storms from her childhood, how she used to sit by this same window, counting the seconds between thunder and flash. Her aunt would tell her that storms were how the ocean spoke, how it told the sky its secrets. She smiled faintly at the thought. Maybe that was what her life had been these past years, a long storm that had been trying to tell her something. She had finally begun to hear a knock came at the door, light, hesitant. She opened it to find Jack standing there, his hair damp from the mist, his jacket unzipped, rain dotting his shoulders. He held something in his hand, an envelope, yellowed at the edges, tied with a thin ribbon. Found this cleaning out the shed this morning, he said. Thought it might belong to your family. She took it, the paper soft with age, her name written across the front in her aunt's looping handwriting. She hadn't seen it in decades. She invited him in the rain, beginning to thicken the sound of it, drumming softly on the roof. They sat near the fire. She untied the ribbon, carefully unfolding the letter inside the paper, smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Her aunt's familiar scent filled the air. Marianne began to read, her voice low and even as though reading to the waves. My dear girl, if you are reading this, it means the years have carried you farther than I could, but not so far that the harbor cannot call you back. I hope you remember that the heart, like the sea, does not lose what it loves. It simply carries it until the right shore appears again. Marianne stopped reading, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked up at Jack, his eyes steady on her, the firelight dancing across his face. The words felt like they had been written, not just for her, but for this very moment. She took a slow breath, her voice softer. This letter, it feels like she knew I'd come back someday. Jack smiled. She always knew more than she said. Maybe she also knew I'd still be here waiting to fix the same boat. Thunder rolled over the harbor, long and low, the rain now steady. Against the windows, the two of them sat close in the quiet, watching the fire curl and flicker. Marianne felt something inside her ease, some long-held ache beginning to let go. She thought of all the years she had spent trying to rebuild her life, trying to make it make sense when maybe it had never been about rebuilding at all. Maybe it was about returning to what had always been true. The letter lay between them, the ribbon loose across the table. Jack reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against hers, the warmth of that touch steady and sure, not demanding, only there. She didn't pull away, and for the first time, she didn't think about what it meant. She only felt the calm that came with knowing she wasn't alone in the storm. When he finally left, the rain had softened to mist the sky, a pale gray that seemed to glow from within. She stood at the doorway, watching him walk down the narrow path toward the docks, his figure fading slowly into the fog. She held the letter to her chest, the words echoing through her mind. The heart, like the sea, does not lose what it loves. It simply carries it until the right shore appears again. And she whispered into the quiet, I think I finally understand. That night, she sat by the fire again. The old cottage wrapped in the sound of rain, her thoughts drifting between memory and hope. The waves crashed softly beyond the hill, and in that endless rhythm she heard it again, not the roar of a storm, but the whisper of something gentler, something waiting, something new. The next morning broke calm and silver. The rain had washed the world clean. The air tasted of salt and pine and something new. Marianne stepped outside the cottage, barefoot, her robe brushing against the wet grass. The sky hung low but soft. The sea glimmered faintly beneath the lifting mist. Every sound felt sharper. The cry of a gull, the whisper of wind through the reeds, the slow roll of the tide against the rocks. She breathed in deeply and felt something she hadn't in years. Peace, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and full. The letter still lay on the table inside the ribbon, curled loosely beside it. She had read it again before dawn, tracing her aunt's handwriting with her fingers, each word sinking deeper with every pass. There was no instruction in it, no revelation, only a kind of knowing, a reminder that love is not always about beginnings. Sometimes it's about returning, not to someone, but to yourself. She made coffee and carried it down the path toward the harbor. The town was just waking fishermen moving along the docks, the smell of seaweed and diesel drifting over the water. The cafe door was propped open, the same bell chiming softly as she entered, the same worn floorboards creaking beneath her shoes. And behind the counter, Maggie lifted her head with a grin. Well, if it isn't my favorite runaway, how's the storm treating you better than it used to? Marianne said, smiling. They talked for a while, easy and unhurried, about small things, the fare, the weather, the tourists who would soon fill the streets. Maggie leaned forward after a moment, her voice gentler. Jack was here earlier, she said he might head out on the water to check the traps before the fog comes. Dak left something for you. Too, she reached beneath the counter and handed over a folded piece of paper, damp at the corner. Marianne took it slowly, her pulse quickening. It wasn't much, just a small note written in Jack's careful hand. Meet me where the rocks meet the sea. She read the words twice, feeling their weight, the same spot beneath the lighthouse where they had stood the night of the fair. She tucked the note into her pocket, thanked Maggie, and stepped back into the morning, the air cool against her skin, the path already calling her forward. Walk was quiet, only the sea beside her, the sound of waves pulling against the shore. She reached the rocks, breathless from the climb, the mist curling low around her feet, and there he was leaning against it. Weathered railing, his hair caught in the wind, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his smile slow and certain, as if he had known she would come. "Ought I?" "To find you here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He shrugged, half a smile. Maybe we both belong to this view more than we ever did anywhere else. Maybe, she said, the silence stretched between them. Not awkward, just full, the kind that needs no words. He pulled something from his pocket, a small smooth stone, pale gray with a faint line of white running through it, like the horizon itself. "Picked this up years ago," he said. "I'd give it to you if you ever came back." "Why this one?" she asked. "Because it reminded me of you, the way the line cuts through the middle, strong and quiet, never really breaking." She turned the stone over in her hand. The surface cool and perfect, the tide surge below them, foam brushing the rocks. She felt the old ache inside her soften, the years between them shrinking. Like mist under sun, she met his eyes, and there it was again, that steady warmth, that patient kind of love that asks for nothing but to stay. The fog began to lift, slowly revealing the curve of the coastline, the lighthouse tall against the morning sky, the town below, small and alive. Marianne stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his, the sound of the sea rising and falling around them, and for the first time in a long time she did not think about what came next. She only thought about now. The light, the air, the quiet heartbeat of the harbor that seemed to whisper "you're home." That evening the sun slipped low and slow behind the water, painting the harbor in shades of gold and blue, the kind of light that makes everything feel softer, slower, as if the world itself is exhaling. Marianne sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. The stone Jack had given her resting in her palm. She rolled it gently between her fingers, tracing the faint white line again and again. It felt grounding, like the pull of the tide, a reminder of something steady beneath all the change she had spent. The day helping Maggie at the cafe, washing dishes, serving coffee, laughing at stories about the old fishermen who still argued over who caught the biggest lobster every year. It was simple work, but there was a rhythm to it, a comfort she hadn't known. She missed people here, spoke slower, looked you in the eye, remembered your name by the second morning. It made her feel seen again, not as someone who had failed, but as someone who had simply returned. When she got home, the cottage felt different, warmer, maybe she had just begun to notice its kindness, the way the floorboards sighed, the way the sea could be heard through the walls like a heartbeat. She lit a candle, set a kettle on the stove, and found herself drawn to the small writing desk by the window. There was paper there, an old fountain pen left behind by her aunt. She sat down without thinking and began to write. First letter was to herself, or maybe to the version of herself she had once been, the woman who had left this town chasing something she couldn't name. She wrote about the years that had changed her, the love that had ended, the quiet that had followed. She wrote about fear and forgiveness and the slow work of starting over, her words spilling in a steady, unbroken rhythm like rain. She didn't read them back. She just folded the page and tucked it into a small drawer. Then she wrote another, this one to Jack, though she wasn't sure she'd ever give it to him. She wrote about the fair, the dance, the letter from her aunt, the way his eyes had looked when he handed her the stone. She wrote about how peace had begun to return to her like a long-lost song. The words came easy and gentle. When she finished, she sat for a long time listening to the waves, the paper still warm beneath her hand outside. The air had cooled, the wind carrying the scent of the sea and pine. She opened the window and let it in. The candle flickered its flame, bending slightly toward the open air. She thought of her aunt again and smiled softly. Maybe she had known that Marianne would find her way back, not to escape the past, but to understand it. Maybe every storm, every loss, every moment of quiet had been leading her here. A sound outside caught her attention, faint footsteps on the gravel path. She rose and looked through the window. Jack stood there in the fading light, his hands in his pockets. Looking unsure whether to knock or leave, she opened the door before he could decide. Thought I'd check if you were. Still writing, he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I was, she said, and smiled. Come in for tea. They sat again by the fire, steam rising from their cups. The quiet easy between them. He noticed the papers on the desk. Letters, he asked. She nodded. Not the kind I planned to send, but maybe the kind that needed to be written. He smiled softly. I get that sometimes words are just meant to be let go like the tide. She looked at him, the firelight dancing in his eyes, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly still. The night deepened, the waves whispering softly against the rocks. Outside, neither of them spoke again, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered was already understood. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door, his hand brushing hers lightly. I'm glad you came back, he said, and she whispered, I am too. As he stepped out into the night, the wind carried the scent of rain, again gentle and clean, and she knew this wasn't an ending, only another beginning, wrapped in the sound of the sea. The next morning dawned, soft in gold sunlight streaming through the thin curtains, painting pale shapes across the wooden floor. The storm had passed, and the world felt new again. Marianne rose early, the smell of salt and coffee already filling the cottage. She dressed in a light sweater and stepped outside. The air cool against her skin, the town below slowly stirring to life. She could hear the faint clang of the harbor bell, the steady murmur of waves brushing the shore. Everything felt alive in a way that made her chest ache, in the best kind of way. As she walked down toward the docks, she saw Jack near the water, his sleeves rolled, his hands steady as he worked on the small blue boat tied to the post, the same one that had been his father's years ago. She stood for a moment, just watching him, the rhythm of his movements, the quiet patience in the way he tightened a rope, adjusted a sail. It was the same calm that had always drawn her to him, not loud or showy, just sure. Or up early, he said without looking up when she finally approached. Couldn't sleep, she replied, felt like the sea was calling. He smiled, still focused on the knot that refused to stay tied. The sea has a habit of doing that, doesn't it? She laughed softly. Maybe it knows things we don't. Maybe it remembers for you. She looked at her then, the sunlight catching his eyes, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Come with me, he said, just for the morning. The water's calm and the winds in our favor. She hesitated only for a breath, then nodded, the idea of open water pulling at something deep inside her. He helped her into the boat, their hands brushing just enough to spark a warmth that lingered as they pushed off from the dock. The harbor stretched wide before them, quiet and glimmering, the lighthouse standing tall against the horizon. They moved easily through the water, the oars dipping in slow, steady rhythm, gulls circling high above. Marianne closed her eyes for a moment and let the wind catch her hair, the scent of salt filling her lungs. It felt like freedom, not the kind that comes from leaving, but the kind that comes from arriving at last. Where you belong. Jack watched her for a while, then pointed toward a small inlet near the far rocks. That's where your aunt used to take us, remember? He said, where she'd make us promise we'd never forget the sea. She smiled. Of course, I remember, she said. She'd say, the sea will always find you, even when you think you're lost. And maybe she was right, he said quietly. Maybe that's what this is finding. They reached the inlet, the water shallower, clearer the bottom, visible through the gentle sway of tide seaweed, drifting like ribbons below the surface. He anchored the boat, and for a long while they simply sat, the silence between them filled with nothing but the sound of the sea. Marianne traced her fingers along the edge of the boat, feeling the smooth, worn wood, each groove a memory of time and tide. You ever think about leaving? He asked finally. She looked at him. Not lately, she said. I think I've done enough running. I think maybe I'd rather learn how to stay. Jack nodded, the faintest smile touching his face. Then stay, he said quietly. The words simple but full of everything he didn't say. She met his gaze, and something in her heart settled, the kind of peace that Doesn't shout, but hums low and steady. The sun climbed higher, the water shimmering brighter around them, and for the first time in years, Marianne didn't think about what she had lost or what she had to prove. She thought only of this, the sound of the oars. The warmth of the light, the man beside her, the sea stretched wide ahead, endless but somehow kind. She leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the soft heartbeat of the harbor that had never really stopped calling her home. The days that followed unfolded gently like pages in an old book, each one marked by sunlight and the steady rhythm of the sea. Marianne found herself falling into the pace of Greyhaven, waking with the gulls, drinking coffee by the window, walking the harbor paths where the smell of salt and pine wove through the air. She helped Maggie at the cafe when she wanted company read by the fire. When she wanted quiet, and most evenings she would meet Jack by the docks where they talked about everything and nothing, letting the hours drift by like the tide has. Summer stretched on the town, began to prepare for the lantern night, a tradition as old as the harbor itself, a celebration held on the final weekend before autumn arrived, when the whole town gathered to release lanterns across the water, each one carrying a wish or a memory or something meant to be let go. Marianne had watched it once as a girl, the glow of hundreds of lights floating away into the dark. It had always felt like magic. Gentle and bittersweet, when the evening came, the air was still and warm, the sky washed in soft lavender and gold. She walked down to the docks where the townsfolk were gathering, the lanterns lined up along the shore, their paper sides painted with small drawings and words of hope. Jack was there, waiting, a small smile on his face, holding 2 lanterns instead of one figured. "We might share this year," he said, handing her one. She traced her fingers along the edge, the paper cool and delicate. "What are you wishing for?" she asked. He shook his head, not telling ruins the magic. They sat side by side near the end of the dock, the sea calm beneath them, the faint sound of music drifting from the square behind them. Marianne picked up the brush from the table beside them, dipped it into the small jar of ink, and began to write her hand. Steady across the paper, not a wish exactly, but a truth she needed to let go, she wrote, "I forgive myself," and then beneath it, "I am home." When she finished, she looked at Jack. He had already written his and was watching her with quiet eyes ready. She asked. He nodded. Together they lit the lanterns, the flames flickering softly inside like tiny beating hearts. The paper glowed gold against the dark, and as they lowered them into the water, the sea caught their light and carried it gently outward, the glow joining the hundreds of others, drifting slowly into the horizon. They stood in silence, watching the lanterns move farther and farther until they looked like stars scattered across the waves. Jack's hand brushed against hers. She didn't pull away, the warmth of it steady and grounding. The sky deepened into indigo, the moon rising pale and perfect above the lighthouse, the air filled with the murmur of voices, laughter, music, and the quiet breath of the tide. She turned to him, her voice soft. "You ever think we could have done this differently?" He looked out at the water. "Maybe, but then we wouldn't be who we are now. Maybe this is the only way it could have." Then she nodded, feeling tears that weren't sad, just full. "I think maybe you're right," she said. "The sea doesn't rush, the tide comes when it's ready." They stayed there long after most of the crowd had gone. The last lanterns still floating like dreams across the surface, the sound of the waves soft and rhythmic. Marianne leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapping around her. Without words, it wasn't about promises or plans. It was about presence, the quiet kind that fills the air between two people who have learned how to listen. When they finally walked back toward the town, the lights of Greyhaven shimmered behind them, the scent of sea and smoke following them down the path. The night felt endless and kind, and in her chest, Marianne felt something open wide, like a sail catching the wind. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she didn't need to know. She was already where she was meant to be. The dawn came quiet and golden, the sea stretching wide and endless, the light touching every corner of Greyhaven like a gentle promise. Marianne stood at the edge of the shore barefoot, her hair tangled from the breeze, the hem of her dress brushing. The cool water, each wave folding softly around her ankles, the town still asleep behind her, the only sound the hush and sigh of the tide moving in and out. Steady as breath, she thought of the months that had passed, the slow healing of days spent. In the rhythm of this place, the laughter in the cafe, the quiet hours by the fire, the walks with Jack along the harbor path, everything that had once felt heavy had become lighter each. Memory reshaped by time and kindness, she thought of her aunts. Letter in the line she had read so many times, the heart like the sea does not lose what it loves. It simply carries it until the right shore appears again. And now she finally understood. It wasn't about finding something lost. It was about being found. Behind her footsteps approached soft on the sand. Jack's voice low and familiar morning, he said. She smiled without turning. I knew you'd be here. He stepped beside her, his gaze following the horizon. You always did like the sunrise, she glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. I think I just like beginnings, he nodded. Quietly, maybe that's what this is, then a beginning. She looked out over the water again, the light spreading wider, brighter. The sea turning silver and blue and gold. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, just listening, the wind weaving through their hair, the gulls crying somewhere. Above the world, still simple and infinite, she felt his hand find hers, the warmth of it grounding, sure their fingers laced together naturally without thought, the kind of touch that feels like a truth, not a question. He spoke softly after a while. You staying this time? She smiled, eyes on the horizon. I think the harbor's waited long enough for me. Jack squeezed her hand. Gently, guess it has, he said. The silence that followed was easy, filled with the hum of the sea and the soft call of morning, the kind of silence that feels like peace. The tide rolled higher, brushing against their feet, cool and alive, the world waking. Fully around them, sunlight breaking across the water like scattered gold. Marianne closed her eyes and let the sound of the waves fill her completely. She didn't think of yesterday or tomorrow, only now, the air, the light, the warmth beside her. She breathed in deep and whispered more to herself than to him, I'm home. And the sea answered in its own quiet language. The rhythm of the waves rising and falling again and again, steady, certain, endless, the sound of a love that had never really gone, only waited patient as the tide for her to return. Thank you for listening to Whispers of the Harbor, a story about second chances, quiet love, and the peace that comes when we finally find our way home. Close your eyes, breathe with the sound of the sea, and remember some tides are meant to return. Drift asleep peacefully while listening to the soothing background music. Good night.